Hello, welcome to the second video of what's happening in the American home front during the Cold War. In our last video, we talked about the nuclear arms race and the space race and how that had a huge impact on America socially, right? How there were growing tensions internationally with the heightened nuclear arms race, but also at home, there were constant fears of communism. And that's sort of what we're going to get into today. What's happening on the American home front while all these global events are happening, while the United States government is competing with the Soviet Union, what's happening at home. And the first person we're going to talk about today is Joseph McCarthy, who was a Republican senator from Wisconsin. He was a Irish Catholic, and McCarthy, he fueled fears during the early 50s that communism was rampant and growing in the United States. McCarthy became known as one of the most prominent anti-communist activists in the 1950s and 60s. Now, sort of going back, remember that even after World War One, right, that the United States had this growing fear of communism. We talked about the first Red Scare, which happened during the Russian Revolution in 1917, but also after World War One ended. That on the home front, many communists, many people who aligned themselves with being communists were actually deported and sent away out of the United States. There were also many riots that happened because of this. This is what's known as the first Red Scare. With McCarthy, after World War II, we see a heightened second Red Scare, which was happening. So McCarthy became known as the most prominent anti-communist activist during the 50s and 60s. McCarthy claims that he had a list of supposed growing number of communists in the United States. He said that he had this list of he knew where all the communists were, and if he was put into power, he would ensure that they get imprisoned or they are found out and discovered. And this eventually led to the political ideology of McCarthyism, which really was a cornerstone of the 50s. McCarthyism was a symptom of massive and widespread anti-communist hysteria that engulfed Cold War America. In 1947, President Truman issued the Loyalty Order, or Executive Order 9835, establishing loyalty reviews for federal employees. Essentially, federal employees, government employees, had to register if they were communist or not. And then the FBI conducted closer examinations of all potential security risks among foreign secretary officers. And between 1949 and 1954, congressional committees conducted over 100 investigations into subversive activities. Anti-subversion committees emerged over a dozen state legislatures, and these review committees went into public schools and universities across the country. For example, the University of California, they they dismissed 31 professors in 1950 for refusing to sign a loyalty or oath, saying that they weren't communist, right? And really, this sort of thing is sort of crazy that one's political affiliation in America, where we believe in political freedom, right? The freedom of expression and our own ideas, that this is limited to communism at this time. That if you're a communist, you're seen as an enemy in the United States. And these are our college professors and school teachers and government officials being fired because they refused to sign a piece of paper that said they weren't communist. Now, I mean, even if you apply for government jobs today, you have to sign a piece of paper saying that you don't plan to overthrow the United States or whatever, right? That's understandable. But for just a basic political ideology of communism that itself is not radical. This is sort of a little uncalled for, but this sort of correlates with the massive hysteria that's going on in the United States at this time towards communism. So the International Security Act, or the McCurran Act, passed by Congress in September of 1950, mandated that all communist organizations needed to register to the government, and gave the government greater powers to investigate supposed listed communists. And it made it possible to prevent suspected individuals from gaining or keeping their citizenship. Some American citizens got their citizenship revoked simply for being communists at this time. Anti-communist attitudes and fears in the U.S. corresponded with global events that were taking place in the Cold War. Like in 1949, the Soviets, they developed their own atomic bomb. And also in 1949, remember that China, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, became communist itself. And we also have spy satellites like Sputnik in the 1950s. So people are really freaking out about the Soviet Union. There was many people believed that the Soviet Union could just attack them any day, and even worse, that there were supposed communist spies living in their backyard. These heightened fears in America caused people like McCarthy to pass stricter restrictions on Americans based on their political beliefs. However, the threat that Soviet spies had entered America was somewhat true. So, for example, during World War II, Julius Rosenberg worked briefly at the U.S. Army Signal Corps laboratory in New Jersey, where he had access to classified information. He and his wife Ethel, who had both been members of the Communist Party in the United States in the 1930s, were accused of passing secret bomb-related documents to Soviet officials, and were inducted in August 1950 on charges of giving nuclear secrets over to the Russians. After a trial in March of 1951, they were found guilty, and on June 19th, 1953, they were executed for espionage. Right? So these were actually convicted Soviet spies who were in the United States. And the Soviets, they did have spies in the United States, and we had spies over in the Soviet Union as well. But the fact that there were spies in the U.S. so close to home, giving away national secrets, this panicked many Americans. Another spy example I'll talk about is the case of Algar Hiss. He was the highest ranking government official linked to Soviet espionage. Hiss was a prominent official in the U.S. State Department and served as the Secretary General of the UN in San Francisco from April to June 1945, before leaving the State Department in 1946. A young congressman and member of HUAC, which we'll talk about in just a second, Richard Nixon, made waves by accusing Hiss of espionage. And on August 3rd, 1948, Whittaker Chambers testified before the HUAC, saying that he and Hiss worked together as part of a secret communist underground in the 1930s. Hiss, who always maintained his innocence, he denied it until his last breath. Said that he didn't have anything to do with this, that he wasn't a Soviet spy. But later evidence coming out in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, actually reported that yes, Hiss was a Soviet spy who spied on America in the 30s and 40s. So Algar Hiss and the Rosenbergs offered anti-communists such as Joseph McCarthy the evidence that they needed to alleged vast Soviet conspiracy in the United States. They basically said, see these two examples, this means that the Soviets are everywhere. They have spies everywhere. Uh, your communist neighbor could be a Soviet spy. So this further demonized communists in the United States. And but in 1950, President Truman discredited McCarthy and said that most of the allegations that McCarthy made were totally were totally biased and false. That McCarthy said that he had all these names of communist spies, but in reality, that evidence didn't really hold up. So eventually, McCarthy many American progressives saw McCarthy's crusade as nothing else but a political witch hunt, used to give McCarthy more political power by imprisoning and discrediting many innocent Americans. For a while, many people in the U.S. gave into McCarthyism, but after news that many of McCarthy's claims were false and discredited, the Truman campaign, who brought this about, were also discouraged or discredited because of this. That his campaign, Truman's campaign, was actually hurt because for a while he did support McCarthy, and then he eventually found out that McCarthy was somewhat full of BS, which hurt his political campaign. Even though McCarthy himself was discredited towards the late 50s, uh, the idea of McCarthyism and this fear of communists in the United States actually lived on well into the 60s. The director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, is a excellent example of this. He was a staunch anti-communist in the United States, and he's the director of the FBI. So Hoover's FBI helped indicate and incite panic by assisting the creation of the Belanti propagandist films and television shows. Um, Such as The Red Menace, My Son in 1951, I Lead Three Lives in 1953. Such a J. Edgar Hoover, he sort of created these anti-communist propaganda films, right? And such alarmist depictions of espionage and treason in the free world really heightened panic for many Americans. Many Americans viewed these anti-communist political videos, films, and they really were panicked by it. Another example of one of those anti-communist propaganda films was that "Make Mine Freedom" video that I posted over to Blackboard, right? Today, if we view that through our modern lens, it's a little cheesy, right? Saying that America has everything we could offer. We have freedom, we have justice, and all that good stuff. And communism's just bad. But that's just a classic example of the arguments that were being made against communism at this point. That especially in that "Make Mine Freedom" video, which I encourage you to watch. If you choose to watch those two propaganda videos and write a 1 page paper about and 1.5 page paper about it by this Sunday, I will replace any zero grade that you have. If you don't have any zero grades, I will replace. I will just put that in a bonus grade column. So I encourage you to watch those videos. They're excellent examples of propaganda videos that are happening at this time. But basically, it's saying that communism, at face value, they're saying that, like, oh yeah, communism is great. But when you dig a little deeper, you see that communism itself is not great. That has many flaws in it. It takes away your freedom and all that good stuff. That's what these videos are trying to sort of say and argue. Say that even though communism says that it has nice things that it has to offer, really it's evil and it's against American values, which we'll get into in a little bit. All right, so like I said, the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover were cracking down on socialists and communists, especially in the media. Um, and in the fall of 1947, HUAC, the House of Un-American Activities Committee, um, entered the fray with a highly publicized hearing of Hollywood, right? So the film mongrel Walt Disney, the actor Ronald Reagan, and among many others testified to aid investigators in attempts to expose the communists in Hollywood. The big thing is that Hollywood, right, produces these films, and the United States at this time was like, well, we want good capitalist Americans with American values to produce films. We don't want communists to produce films, right? That communists are the enemy, and if we have those communists in Hollywood, that's a problem. So the big point of HUAC was to, in J. Edgar Hoover's efforts, were to snuff out all the communists within Hollywood. So a group of writers and directors and producers who refused to answer these questions were held in contempt of Congress. This group of writers and directors were known as the Hollywood 10. So the Hollywood 10, they were blacklisted from Hollywood. They weren't allowed to produce or be a part of any films in Hollywood, and they were just barred from the industry. Some of these people, they just because they refused to sign a piece of paper or testify in court against communism, they were barred from Hollywood. They weren't allowed to participate, and many of them were actually their whole careers just ended at that point because they didn't produce the media that the United States wanted to accept, right? And this is really against the freedom of speech. That it goes against our Constitution to bar someone for their right to speech, right? That everyone has the freedom to believe the things that they want to believe. But at this point, that was severely limited to everyone besides communists, right? And if you were aligned with communism at this time, you were largely discredited. In many cases, people were deported or lost their jobs, their livelihoods, and their whole careers just ended because of their political beliefs or because they took a stand against this, saying that, hey, this is against the Constitution, you can't really do that. And the US government was basically like, well, we're the government, we can do that, and because of that, we're going to punish you. So, just another classic example that where America, home of the free, right? But at the same time, when we take a deeper look, really not that long ago, right? Like about 60 or 70 years ago, and we see that there were many cracks beneath the surface, many freedoms being barred because of someone's political affiliation or because of someone's race or ideology or creed. These things were all taken into account. So that's another reason why we need to look at history, right? See that, hey, things weren't always perfect. Things weren't that even though our standard, right, is freedom, in many cases we don't live up to that. And the most of the American story was to actually build up and deliver that promise of freedom that our founding fathers created back when the country was created. All right, so anyway, in these trials, in these trials that HUAC sort of offered and stuff, they would ask questions like, "Are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?" And many witnesses actually cooperated, right, out of fear of losing their own jobs or because in some ways they really did fear communism. And they were asked to name names, right? Say naming anyone they knew who has ever been associated with Communist Party or groups of that organization. And this all led to the Second Red Scare, which was a inquisition that was taking place in Hollywood, spurred by and this was sort of spurred by the playwright author Arthur Miller with his popular play The Crucible in 1953. The Crucible, talking about the Salem witch trials and that stuff. I'm sure you had to read that book in high school or whatever. I certainly did. So talking about the Salem witch trials, right, which was, and so it was literally a witch hunt, right, where people were supposed to name names like, "Are you a witch?" And then if they were a witch, they were convicted and executed and all that stuff. Uh, and Arthur Miller was sort of correlating the history of the Salem witch trials, a witch hunt, with what's happening in Hollywood at that point, saying like, look, the government's saying, uh, point to who's a witch, right? Point to who's a communist, and they were put on trial because of that. So the Crucible play was sort of just to heighten that look, this is happening. It's a witch hunt, and are we really doing the right thing? Are we really improving on what we're supposed to be about? Um, so meanwhile, while all this is happening in Hollywood, there was a change in religion as well, that was happening in the 1950s. Um, Now McCarthy, in his speech, called for an all-out battle, against communist atheism, with Christianity, basically saying that the Soviet Union, the ideology of communism is atheist, right? They are against God, and that America is basically for God. That we are a Christian nation meant to oppose communism. That if anyone's a communist, they can't really be a true American because they don't have religion. That's basically what McCarthy's arguing at this time. And Cold Warriors argued that communism was an anti-Christian and therefore anti-American political ideology. And this spawned a huge movement by religious figures to further demonize communism. For example, Baptist minister Billy Graham, that's that picture on the left here. He was a huge religious figure, who I think died a couple of months ago, but he was a huge religious figure. Um, he's In one of his sermons in the 1950s, uh, he argued that communism aimed to destroy the American home and cause the moral deterioration, leaving the country exposed to communist infiltration. So Billy Graham, one of the huge and most popular Baptist ministers in the country at this time, and he ministered against communism, right? Which was a huge thing because everyone at this point many Americans, many million Americans, listened to Billy Graham over the radio, over the TV. So if he said like, "Hey, communism is anti-American and we should be against communism," many people really believed that. Um, so in the early years of the Cold War, many Americans believed that national belonging and citizenships were actually closely linked with each other. And Americans during the early Cold War years, attended church, and professed their belief in a supreme being, and stressed the importance of religion more so in the entirety of American history. In the 1950s, it's the most religious on average that America has ever been. Right, and tied up with this heightened boost of Christianity, somewhat caused by Billy Graham and other televangelists like him, we see a heightened increase of church participation in the United States, and also this link between Christianity and American being American, right? That in order to be a good American, you have to believe in a God, right? That these things have to be hand in hand with each other. And if you're a communist, you're inherently against God, which means that you're inherently against America. And for example, in 1954, the Pledge of Allegiance was altered to include the words "One Nation under God." And in 1956, "In God We Trust" was adopted as the official national motto. So "One Nation under God," part of our pledge, and "In God We Trust," which is part of our national motto. These things were actually put in place in the 1950s. And that's something I really didn't know about either. I always thought that these things had always existed, right? But it turns out that they were just added um, at a point in American history where many Americans were more religious on average than they had ever been. Um, so that's just something to think about, right? That these things, in God we trust, and one nation under God, they were just added in the 1950s, and part of the reason why they were added was because of this Cold War period, this tensions, this fear that America could potentially turn communist and lose that Christian faith. Um, so Also, in addition to that, in popular culture, one of the most popular films of the decade, The Ten Commandments, was also produced in 1956, which retold the biblical Exodus story as a Cold War parable comparing the Soviet Union to a slave state. So even the Ten Commandments, which was at point one of the most popular films of all time, was actually a parable to talk about what's happening with the Soviet Union, and it was a slave state, and that through religion they could be liberated, right? Um, so in recent years, there's been this debate if we should even have "In God We Trust" in our motto, or "One Nation Under God" in our pledge, and this argument has are things that were only created like 70 years ago, that they were just put in place at a specific point in American history during this Cold War time, during a time where church participation was higher than it had ever been. Um, and many people are arguing that we should actually take that out of the pledge and motto, saying that isn't one of the core beliefs of our founding fathers, a division of church and state. But on the other hand, the other side of the argument, some people argue that religion as its fact is a core of American history. Think back to like the Puritans, who were the first European settlers in North America. Their whole deal was establishing a religious community, a religious colony in America, right? A city on a hill. Also, the American colonies were a safe haven for religion as well, where people of all religions could come and worship as they see fit. So they're both ends of this argument, but I want you to really keep in mind that the origins of this, because I think it really is pertinent to our lives today. But And both of these arguments have their own weight, and they're equally tied to this issue of American history. Um, so, uh, on one hand, there's this heightened religious freedom going on, and more acceptance of different types of religion. At a time when political freedom became more restricted in the United States, religious freedom and freedom of religious belief became more acceptable in the United States. For example, we talked about that through most of American history, Catholicism was actually persecuted against in the United States, or seen as not true Americans, right? The big argument was that Catholics were more loyal to the Pope in Italy than they were to being true Americans, right? So many WASP, right, like white Anglo-Saxon Americans, they didn't really trust Catholics at this point, and this didn't help with the influx of Irish immigrants in the late 1800s coming in either. So there was this huge disdain for Catholics in the United States. But during the 1950s, we see a change in that, showing that many of these typical people who were seen as the true Americans, right, the white Anglo-Saxon Americans, they they tended to accept in a um, greater numbers people of other religions, right? And this is huge, that we became more accepting of other religions, right? Think about our Constitution, which had freedom of religion in it, and that was true, but you had to be essentially Protestant and white to become a fully accepted American up until this point where truly freedom of religion was practiced. And the biggest example of this was McCarthy himself was Irish Catholic, and also our first president of the United States, Catholic president of the United States, JFK, came to power. And this wouldn't have happened before World War II. That it was really this time where more religions became accepted in the United States, that we got a president like JFK who was a Catholic. Now, many people at that time did have those same historic arguments that, like, oh, JFK is just going to be more loyal to the Pope than he is the American people. But really, at this time, as long as you were Christian, but in some cases, Jews were also accepted as Americans at this point because of this heightened religious community that was taking place in America at this time. But we'll get more about that in the 60s and stuff when we talk about when JFK himself was actually elected. All right, um, we covered a lot in this video talking about how anti-communist sentiment and fears were at its height during the 50s and 60s in the Cold War, and its impact on media, on politics, on religion. These things are all intertwined with each other, and I expect you to answer and talk about this if you choose to answer this question for the final, right? How was the American home front impacted by the Cold War? All right, so that's basically this second video. The third and last video for this Cold War lecture is going to deal with decolonization and what's happening around the world and America's sort of response to that. All right, so I encourage you to watch that last video, and